Hello, and welcome to the Eras of Western Women, a limited series CFD podcast. During these 4 episodes, we're celebrating the Year of the Cowgirl. 2024 has been designated as the Year of the Cowgirl by Cheyenne Frontier Days, and there's certainly a lot to talk about. I'm Diane Schober, the Executive Director at the Wyoming Office of Tourism. I'm a lifelong fan of Cheyenne Frontier Days and so intrigued with this series of podcasts exploring women and women in the West.
A part of Western history, a legend walking tall. Cheyenne Frontier Days, the daddy of all.
Joining me today is an expert and an expert historian, Mike Castle. Mike's the Associate Director and Curator of Collections here at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum. During these 4 episodes of the podcast, we're celebrating the Year of the Cowgirl and the eras of women from diverse backgrounds who have made history in our Western way of life. Hi, Mike. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, Diane. How are you?
I'm doing well. So this episode, we're moving into the era of 1930 to 1960 and the women who really shaped history during this time frame. There were some very transformational things that happened during this era.
Very transformational, yes.
Yes, and certainly in the world of rodeo and what women were doing in the West. Why don't you introduce us to a few of the highlights?
So some of the highlights that we have to understand is that the world now has movie cameras. They have film. We have movie stars. We have the Great Depression. We have so many things that are starting to impact what's happening in the rest of our society. But the fact that we are really popular in Cheyenne Frontier Days during this time because thanks to the silent films in Hollywood and the Western, people want to see this authentic Western experience for themselves. And so they start coming out to Cheyenne in ever greater numbers, even despite the hardships that are being brought on by the Great Depression. And so it's a really fascinating time.
A very fascinating time. And certainly a lot was happening that were breaking glass ceilings for women. You and I have talked about
Absolutely,
a few of those.
again.
And some of the things that were happening around not only the Wild West show and rodeo activities, but in other ways of American life.
Right. And Wyoming is right at the forefront of this again, which I think is
Once again, we
fascinating.
find Wyoming there and the women of the West really leading these movements and demonstrating to others what is possible.
Right. Absolutely.
So let's talk about Sally Rand, Miss Frontier White Bucks. This is a very interesting story to me.
Yes, she is an interesting character and extremely controversial even to this day. She was actually one of the later women that we could possibly talk about. She came into Cheyenne Frontiers in 1936 as a night show act for CFD. They were looking for ways to bring more and more people in. And the reason why she was famous and controversial is that she was a very elegant, beautiful woman that was able to do dances. And the way that she did her dances, and it was at night, was to have herself in a darkened auditorium with a bright light behind her. And she would dance with 2 beautiful, gigantic ostrich feather fans and nothing else.
Very controversial.
Very controversial.
Provocative.
Yes, extremely so. For some reason, incredibly popular.
Yes,
with
I would
some.
imagine.
But as it was also very tasteful because you had the impression of what was happening, but you never got to see anything. She was elegant, to say the very least, and famous around the world for doing this. And Cheyenne Frontier Days was branching out into all kinds of new venues for entertainment, but she represented a really unique time in Cheyenne's Frontier Day history where we had these nationally known dancers who would come to Cheyenne Frontier Days. And we had lots of interesting stuff, but she was wonderful. But another reason why she was wonderful is she was kind of a gossip point because she was in love with another one of the great cowboys of Cheyenne Frontier Days, which is Turk Greenhouse. So she was an item for the relationship between them. We're familiar with Taylor Swift's relationship now and how that draws people's attention. This was doing exactly the same thing in the 1930s.
She was pop culture of her day.
She was pop culture of her day. And when she came to Cheyenne Frontier Days, that made huge ripples and was fantastic for us. But she also gave us an enduring gift, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And that was the fact that when she arrived, she came here in these beautiful, pure white, custom-made buckskins. And they were absolutely gorgeous. And obviously, she's not going on with fans around all the time. So she's out in parades and meeting the public in these beautiful outfits. And that inspired Miss Frontier and Lady in Waiting, which are also new women that need to be talked about during this time period. And that becomes their outfit that they continue to wear to this day, is inspired by her.
And the beautiful white buckskin
And the beautiful
fringe
white
and
buckskin
everything.
fringe. Yes.
Yeah, I think, just to know that what started then as something that was unique and popular has become a longstanding tradition. As we know that Cheyenne Frontier Days and this Western Festival is steeped in tradition.
Absolutely. It's steeped in
It's
tradition.
very interesting. So then, another interesting thing that was happening at the time was around United Airlines.
Well, right,
And I
right.
have to tell you, I was only vaguely aware of this when I moved to Cheyenne in 2003 and visited where our Department of Aeronautics is housed and saw this plaque on the wall. And then other things started tumbling in and more that I learned. So you have a lot of information on what I'm teeing up here.
Yes, I do.
Let's talk
Yes.
about this.
What everybody doesn't, I mean, Cheyenne was at the heart of the United States aviation industry in ways that we can't even possibly begin to imagine now. Cheyenne's airfield was on the airmail route initially, the transcontinental airmail route across the hardest part of the country here through the Rocky Mountains, and became incredibly important. In 1927, Boeing Air Transport was created as an adjunct to the Boeing Aircraft Company to become one of the first airlines in the nation and was headquartered here in Cheyenne because the route that they flew was between San Francisco and Chicago. And between them, if you draw a straight line, is Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so Bill Boeing, the man who builds all these who started the company that builds these big airliners, designed his first passenger planes to fly here in our city, to be able to fly across the United States, regardless of the conditions that they would face.
And if they could fly through these harsh conditions, then they could probably almost fly anywhere.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. So it
Yes.
was a great testing ground for his planes,
Of course.
but it was a fantastic thing to have this airline here. But this airline is a cutting edge airline, one of the biggest in the world, and it's going to be at the forefront in ways that they had no idea that this was going to happen. It just so happened that a young woman around 1929 by the name of Ellen Church, who was a professional nurse in San Francisco, who loved the idea of flying, wanted to see whether or not there was a job in aviation for women. She was told quite flatly that there were no jobs available to her because women were not allowed to fly. Pilots were very much like sailors and thought it made as much sense to fly an airplane with a woman on board as it did to fly a plane with only one wing. So they decided that's not a good thing.
A very stark
A
contrast.
very stark contrast. Well, she persisted and she found a friend in San Francisco, and together they proposed to their bosses here in Cheyenne that one of the things that would really generate a lot of people to start being willing to fly, and it was still considered the barnstorming area, so people stayed away from flying as much as possible because they thought it was incredibly dangerous. If you have young women who would be able to get on board, that would demonstrate that if these young women could fly and take care of you and make this a good experience, there was no reason why you shouldn't try it yourself. And so, with Ellen Church, Mr. Stinson brought 8 young women from across the United States to Cheyenne, Wyoming in May of 1930 and trained them to be the world's first stewardesses here in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
So the flight attendant and the spirit of hospitality on passenger aircraft was born right here in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Right here in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And it became so popular, and nobody else did this, but it became so popular that within 2 years, every airline around the world was doing the same thing.
So certainly that we were the first place where they were trained. And then I really have been a part of global airline service ever since. I mean, obviously we fly today and we know that they're there for the purpose of our safety and not just the hospitality of what we're doing. But United Airlines, this was their training ground for flight attendants.
Right. Boeing Air Transport quickly got rolled into United Airlines. And during the course of the 1930s and the 1940s, United Airlines fixed all of their airplanes here in Cheyenne. Now, the stewardess school during that time period, because it became so much bigger, went to Chicago for a period. But after World War II, they needed another place to train stewardesses, and Cheyenne basically got moved beyond. As technology expanded, they had new plans for new planes. United didn't want to leave Cheyenne in a lurch, and so they decided to move their stewardess training program here after World War II. And for the next 20 years, every single flight attendant that was flying for United Airlines was trained here in our city.
In Cheyenne, Wyoming.
In Cheyenne, Wyoming.
And at that time, flight attendants were only women.
That's correct.
So this was a new era for women, but exclusively for women in passenger air service.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah. So there's if you're downtown Cheyenne and you're visiting maybe a place where you want to get an adult beverage or or walk around, there is the historic Peacock Alley.
Oh my goodness, yes, that's a fun story.
It is. It is. And so, when I moved here to Cheyenne in 2003, I remember going into the Plains Hotel and having drinks and then walking through there and hearing all kinds of stories and legends. But I'd love for you to elaborate on what Peacock Alley was and how it got its name.
Okay, so the Plains Hotel, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's our big, beautiful hotel that we have downtown that's a cornerstone of our community. As it was, this was the place for everybody to go to celebrate, particularly a place called the Wigwam Lounge down on the first floor. Well, the stewardesses that were being trained in Cheyenne from 1947 all the way up until 1961, they were expected to be at the school doing their jobs just like anybody else would be doing for basically an 8-hour day from 9 to 5 to being trained. In the evenings, however, especially on Friday nights, the women would sometimes want to go out as a group to celebrate a birthday or just have a nice time to go dancing or otherwise. And the closest and best place to go was the Plains Hotel. Now, the problem is that you couldn't just have all of these young women show up all at once at the front doors of the hotel. It would cause too much of a commotion. So they decided that there was this alleyway, this access point that actually went to Capitol Avenue. And the cowboy who drove their wooden-sided little bus decided that would be the best place to drop them off so they wouldn't cause a scene. Because young men, of course, were paying attention to Friday nights.
Where there are young women, there will usually be young men.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And so in an attempt, and a very bad one, I suppose, to go ahead and try and avoid any unfortunate circumstances or unseemly possibilities, the cowboy dropped these young women off at Peacock Alley where they could gracefully and quietly enter through the back door into the Wigwam Lounge, and then the young men would be able to address them after they arrived. Unfortunately, because young men are, of course, very enterprising along these lines, got word that the women were coming up this alley, and there are many stories in the Plains Hotel where the young men would line up on either side of the door that opened to this alley and be in their finest, and here come all the stewardesses who are also dressed in their finest, and as they emerged from the door, they would ask for a dance, even before they got to the Wigwam Lounge, and because all the men were preening and getting ready, and all the women were getting ready, it became known as Peacock Alley.
Yeah. Showing off just like a peacock.
Just showing off like a peacock, yes.
Yeah, so you can still, Peacock Alley, the entrance is right near where the Paramount coffee shop is today, and it connects into the banquet space of the Plains Hotel. But such an interesting part of aviation and things that I don't think people really realize what was happening here in the West as women were being trained, and how that's such a part of our everyday travel.
Absolutely, that's right.
Air. Speaking of people who are flying and women who are breaking some barriers, one of the most interesting and certainly faces another mystery around the disappearance is Amelia Earhart.
Yes.
And she loved Wyoming and spent a lot of time here. Talk to us a little bit about Amelia Earhart.
Well, of course, everybody remembers Amelia Earhart in the same breath you would with Charles Lindbergh. She was a pioneer who broke barriers and was somebody that was willing to use the airplane to challenge the contrast between space and time using the airplane. And so she came later than Charles Lindbergh. Of course, he made his famous flight in 1927. She rose to the fore as a female aviator, and there were not that many female aviators at that time. Around 1930, she started becoming noticed for some of the stunts that she was being able to do. She started setting off, after she learned how to fly, she started making long-distance flights and setting records. Almost every time she went into the air, she was setting a new record for women with aviation. And eventually, in 1930 and 31, she was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, which naturally catapulted her. They treated these pilots like astronauts from the Apollo space program. They were everything to people, and demonstrations of what was possible with technology, but also with bravery and fortitude. Absolutely. And so Amelia Earhart, after she became famous, and her fame just kept skyrocketing because she was basically showing the way for young women to follow her into aviation as pilots. Everything was possible. Well, she would fly across the United States, and the way that you got across the United States was to follow the old transcontinental airmail route. You didn't fly from New York to Denver. You flew from New York to Cheyenne, and then down to Denver, and then back again. And so she did the same thing multiple times. The first time that she flew across the United States trying to set records and also to advertise, because she was very happy to promote herself too, she was flying in what they call an autogyro, which is an early type of helicopter.
Yes.
And she flew that here in 1931 and landed here. And
Here in Cheyenne.
here in Cheyenne. Then she flew down to Denver, then back to Cheyenne, and then flew it on to Los Angeles, which was the whole point of her entire trip. And that was her first trip, and she just spent the night here. And of course, that made big news. Even Casper papers were picking up that Amelia Earhart arrived. But then she never went back a different way. But she continued every once in a while to fly across the United States and land here at Cheyenne. One point when she was making a quiet flight, she had a carburetor problem in her plane filled with smoke just outside of Cheyenne. And she was forced to land here, and she hadn't intended to, but she was feeling so nauseous, she needed to take a break from the flight while they were repairing her aircraft. So the minute United Airlines invited her to actually go into the basement of their headquarters building, which is right next to the post office on the airport grounds downtown, to sleep with the telephone exchange switches down in the basement where she wouldn't be interrupted. It was nice and cool. And yes, those do exist. And so she did go down there and took off again. But she also returned again in the mid 1930s, just about the same time that Cheyenne Frontier Days was in play, and she actually stayed to watch the show. And she met Mr. Bonifay, who was the editor of the Denver Post. Miss Wyoming was there, not Miss Wyoming at this point, but Miss Frontier. She was there to greet her with the plane, and she saw the rodeo herself and loved it.
Well, I know she spent a lot of time in Wyoming, and certainly her flights brought her through here, but she spent a lot of time at the Pitchfork Ranch outside of Meeteetse, Wyoming. And just prior to her last flight,
Yes.
I know was there. And if you are in that section of Wyoming, if you're up in Park County, you certainly at the Meeteetse Museum, you can find out more about her there and her life in Wyoming. A lot of photographs that document that. And then
Yes.
but from her time frame, then when she was here at Cheyenne Frontier Days, and then how much longer before her flight around the world, her attempt to make that flight?
The flight was in 1937.
Okay.
And unfortunately, when she flew, she was going, of course, the other direction, flying from New York, going across Europe and otherwise. But it was when she was transiting across the Pacific that she absolutely disappeared. To this day, nobody knows where she went.
One of the greatest mysteries.
One of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century is what happened to Amelia Earhart. At the time that she disappeared, the foundation of her cabin in her Meeteetse was being built. And so it's a very sad end to that whole affair that she never was able to finish it. And her continued story about how she was going to be involved with Wyoming was cut short.
Yeah, just another amazing woman who was breaking, as we've referenced many times, breaking barriers, a rodeo term, but certainly doing things that other women would aspire to be. And I think that only demonstrates what Amelia Earhart did, is these were not without risk.
No.
There was great risk to all of these women who were taking these chances, but yet through a sense of entrepreneurship and guts and glory, we're moving forward in their quest.
Absolutely.
So, Miss Frontier, the first Miss Frontier.
Yes.
Let's talk about the first Miss Frontier.
Oh, my goodness.
During this era.
Jean Nimmo Du Bois. What a wonderful young lady she was. It's kind of fun. When we think about Miss Frontier, obviously we know about all the things that they have to do, traveling around the country, being glamorous on horseback, glamorous at every occasion that they have the opportunity to be as beautiful ambassadors. But it had to start somewhere. Well, Jean Nimmo Du Bois followed Helen Bonham. Helen Bonham disappeared as Miss Wyoming, representing with Cheyenne Frontier Days in 1922, specifically because she got married. And after that,
she was no longer Miss.
She was no longer a Miss and could no longer have that job. So she literally vanishes from the newspapers and everything else. And then we have a span of 9 years where we have nobody that represents Cheyenne Frontier Days. And finally, in 1931, Cheyenne Frontier Days decided to have a contest to have young women here in the city of Cheyenne to actually try and boost the event by selling tickets through their organizations that they worked for, or through friends, to try and get as many ticket sales as possible. And the winner would then represent Cheyenne Frontier Days as Miss Frontier.
And that is a tradition that's still alive today, and quite an honor for young women of our era to serve as Miss Frontier.
Absolutely.
And these are, I think the thing that's interesting too, is these are women who not only embody the ability to be ambassadors, but they truly embody the Western spirit.
Absolutely. And to the initial standpoint, the young women who could participate had to be from pioneer families from Wyoming. So they had to be ranchers, or they had to be somebody that was here that has that history of people taking on this rugged environment and making it home.
And then, uh, uh, isn't there's another fact that's in there about when Miss Du Bois was actually named Miss Frontier, and that that was one of the years that they sold the most
But
tickets.
she sold the most tickets. That's how she won.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. So that was
Right.
yeah, a good way to be not only a marketer, but to also, earn your worth.
Oh my goodness, yes, it was.
Yeah,
And I
yes.
love it. When they had Miss Frontier, and of course, once she was fantastic. And she was featured on many of the movie reels that came through. She was featured in the night shows. She did everything that you would ask a Miss Frontier to be. But nobody would recognize her as a Miss Frontier unless they were told she was a Miss Frontier. If you looked at the old photographs, she usually wore anything, really nice togs or anything else like that for being a cowgirl. But the only way that would identify her is a banner that she would pin to the front of her shirt. So we had mentioned Sally Rand before. She didn't have that iconic costume or that
Yes.
regalia that would identify this person, no matter where she was, as Miss Frontier. And so, for the longest period of time, the only way that you'd be able to recognize Miss Frontier is either by being told she was Miss Frontier, or gradually we started wearing special shirts with a logo patch on the shoulder, which was a bucking horse at the time. But it was really with Sally Rand that Miss Frontier was able to become that iconic character that we now recognize.
Well, this was such an interesting era, not only for America, but really for elevating the awareness of these women of the West. I think,
Mhm.
with the advent of um, moving films, motion picture, and then adding audio to it with television,
Yes.
it changed the way that we see things and broadened that audience and introduced Cheyenne Frontier Days and the West to so many others. And as I even know today is what that is all set up to do, hopefully, is to intrigue you to want to see the real thing and experience that and be immersed in something that's lovely.
Absolutely.
Well, Mike, that concludes our episode today, and we invite you to join us again for our next episode when we explore the era of 1960 to present. Thank you for joining us for the Eras of Western Women, the limited series Cheyenne Frontier Days podcast.
Part of Western history, a legend walking tall. Cheyenne Frontier Days, the daddy